and gentlemen. I'm very thrilled to welcome you again to our lectures within the GIAN program. Anyway, so today that will be a little different. So I'm not going to just, as I did classically, to begin with the title of this lecture, but we're going to just attempt to read this picture. So as you see, this lecture, of course, will elucidate, of course, the content of our lecture today. So as you see, we have a woman with a tablet, and behind her, of course, it's like a picture that shows, of course, like the educational platform. Then you have a man in the center of the picture with a laptop. So this is also what you can read and suggest. So the man is tapping, and behind him, so you see commands, sharing commands, for example, thumbs up, and at the same time, there are people here, so it means global connection. So now let's deduce the symbolic dimension of this picture. So as you see, so woman so is taking the tablet. So it means she is following what's going on the social media. She's following the issue. Maybe the issue is about education. Maybe it's about youth education, university, higher education. So it depends. But she is following an issue. The man also, with his laptop, typing something. He is receiving, of course, some commands. So it depends who he also is following an issue. So we will know later on. So this means that there is like a global connection between all these people, and they are defending something. They are advocating for an issue. So this is, of course, the content of our lecture today, because here we can talk about the social media. So you see the interaction. Maybe this man is reading a newspaper, following an issue. Also, the woman the same thing. So this, of course, clarifies the content of our lecture today, that will be about media advocacy. So we are going to see what do you mean by media advocacy. Of course, in our previous lectures, we have dealt with media tracking. We have defined what do you mean by media. We have seen all the types of media. So today we have seen also development journalism as a type of media. So today we are going to focus on what do you mean by media advocacy. What do you mean by advocacy in the first instance? So we're going to see like the interplay again between media and advocacy, because this is something very important when we question the issue of human rights. Well, so this lecture intends to achieve these objectives. So number one, define advocacy, media advocacy also, and understand its purpose in influencing public opinion and policy. So this is the first thing that we are going to deal with. We are going to define advocacy in the first instance. What do you mean? And we are going to go back to the first picture that we have, of course, used in order to begin. The second objective, to identify the key components and strategies used in media advocacy. So we are going to see what are the key components, what are the strategies, the policies that is used by media advocacy. And we are going to understand also the role of media partnerships and the ethical considerations in media advocacy. So these are the objectives of this lecture today. So what is the first question, for example, that we can ask is, what is advocacy? So I will refer you to a wonderful book by Steve Buckley, okay, in which he has defined pertinently the question of advocacy. It's the act of arguing in favor of a cause, in favor of an issue, in favor of a policy, okay, generally to communicate like directly or constructively with decision makers. So advocacy means openly supporting a certain point of view or a group of people. So according to Steve Buckley, advocacy is the active support of an idea. So you argue for an idea, you argue for a cause, okay? expressed through strategies. So you use many methodologies, many strategies, many policies in order to influence what? To influence opinions, to influence the decisions of people and organizations. So this is a very pertinent definition, of course, that is postulated by Steve Buckley. So later on, I will refer you to the reference if you would like to get deeper into his book. So this is advocacy, and it is very related to media, as we are going to see today. So we are going to see like another mission, another noble mission of the media is that arguing for a very particular cause, for a very particular idea. Unlike traditional media, for example, that just informs or disseminates the news, for example, or spread the news. No, this kind of media advocacy, so it is an issue oriented media. So it's very particular media, very specialized media, as Steve Buckley defines here advocacy. So it's the active support of an idea, of an issue, and we have seen so many issues, for example, as we're going to see media, for example, the advocating for environmental issues, for climate change, tackling those questions like climate change, for example, media advocating for like children's rights, gender equality, and many other up-to-date issues that all communities, for example, suffer from. So we are going to see now, for example, how this advocacy is produced, for example, how it is portrayed. So this picture, of course, illustrates and portrays a concept of media amplification, okay? And of course, what do you mean by amplification? This is reach through digital devices, digital platforms. So you see these mobile phones, for example. So the man, for example, with the megaphone on screen. So it elucidates that he is advocating for the rights of underrepresented people, for example, marginalized people, silenced people, voiceless people. So this, what is important here is that he is amplifying something, and he is voicing something, and he is defending an issue. So this is something which is very important in media advocacy. So that megaphone, of course, represents amplification, voicing something, voicing an issue, and at the same time being very specialized in that issue, because this is what differentiates media advocacy from traditional classical media. So media advocacy is advocating for a cause, for an idea. And people who are, for example, specialized in this, so they work within organizations. We have already get introduced like to the Greenpeace organization, and we have seen to what extent the media members, for example, how they advocate and how they disseminate the news about the Greenpeace movement, or even about the human rights movement, Amnesty International. So we have seen how all these organizations, they work hand in hand with those media amplifiers. So those media people, for example, or those media advocacy members, so they play a very pivotal role in voicing such marginalized, for example, issues. Okay, so we are going to see what do you mean by media advocacy. So media advocacy is a form of journalism, of course, that actively takes a stance on social, political, and cultural, for example, environmental, or cultural, or political, or even environmental issues. So it takes a stance, it has a point of view, and its point of view is very clear. Unlike traditional media, sometimes traditional media, it just informs people in an objective way, in a very neutral way. But media advocacy, no, it's the opposite. It takes a stance, it takes like a very clear standpoint. So and that standpoint is very clear, for example, in its agenda and its strategies also. So this is a very pertinent definition of media advocacy. So from this book by David Bola, this book is entitled Gandhi Journalism: A Communication History, published in 2029. So in this book you will find a wonderful, and I'm going to just I will go back to this book at the end, okay, to show you to what extent even Gandhi played a very important role as a media advocacy journalist. So what is advocacy journalism? It goes beyond the routine, beyond industrialized and neutral reporting that is common in commercial journalism. So this is the first thing. So I'm going to explain to you later on. It goes beyond the superficial summarizing of who, what, when, where, and how an event took place from a dispassionate, non-committal point of view. Advocacy journalists look at the world from a specific point of view and are more likely to focus on how parts are interrelated and why. There is also a sense that the advocacy journalist is forthcoming about the causes, issues, or values that she or he campaigns. So, what is advocacy journalism? So, it goes beyond the routine, beyond the normal thing, beyond, of course, classical, traditional, of course, or standard, unlike standard journalism or standard media, for example. So, this very pertinent advocacy journalism, it goes beyond the routine, beyond industrialized, neutral reporting. Why? Because it takes a very clear stance. It works sometimes, it works with the organization, it advocates for the rights of that organization, it advocates for the issue that that organization, for example, tackles. So it goes beyond the superficial summarizing. It's not like traditional media, for example, it just broadcasts the news with neutrality. Sometimes the people or the classical journalists, they don't care if the issue is important or not. So they care just about broadcasting the issue and maybe gaining many viewers. Unlike media advocacy, it has a noble mission. It has noble objectives and noble aims. So it goes beyond the superficial summarizing of who, what, when, where, and how an event took place from a dispassionate, non-committal point of view. So advocacy journalists look at the world from a specific point of view. Therefore, you find many advocacy, for example, or many media advocacy types. For example, you find like media advocacy in environmental issues, for example, media advocacy like for political issues, media advocacy for climate change, for example, for crimes, for pollution, for water scarcity. So it tackles very specific issues. Why? Because it takes like a stance. It takes a standpoint, and it is more likely to focus on how the parts are related, how that cause has happened. Why, for example, in this era we suffer from this climate change. So this is a question that media advocacy journalists, for example, can ask. Why women in this era, for example, still suffer from from violence, for example? Why women still marginalized? Why children, for example, are still the most vulnerable segments in our society? Why we do have such unfortunately serious issues? So they question, they ask why, and of course there are many strategies that those media advocacy members or journalists use, and I'm going to tackle these things later on. Now let's see now the general focus and the general definition of media advocacy. So there is also a sense that the advocacy journalist is forthcoming. This is something very important even in the strategies that media advocacy journalists, for example, follow, is that they can forthcoming about the causes. Why? Because they study, because they analyze, and this is something very important. They identify the issue. Maybe this is human or women are suffering, are marginalized in that very particular community. And this is something also very important. The space, sometimes they tackle issues in a very particular space, it means the where. Then at a very particular time, sometimes it's the when. And how those issues, for example, are interrelated. Then there is something very important. What are the solutions? So this is another question that media advocacy journalists, for example, ask. So what are the solutions that we can suggest, we can propound in order to solve that issue? Sometimes by finding solutions or by suggesting solutions, they can even forthcome, why not, forthcome causes, forthcome, of course, other issues that may happen to be in the future. And this is, they can even anticipate. This is something very important. So all the time they work in campaign, okay, or campaigning, in joint with, of course, big human rights like organizations. So this is organizations. So this is something which is very specific to media advocacy. And nowadays, especially because we have the rise of those very serious issues that we find in many worldwide communities, so we are in dire need of such media, because of course it works within organizations, and sometimes, as we are going to see at the end, it can be even beyond the borders of the community, and this is something that we aspire to have. So what is media advocacy at the same time? So we're going now to just clarify some very important points that media advocacy, for example, is characterized by. So the first one is clear point of view. So advocacy journalists, they report with a purpose. They report with a perspective. So they have a perspective, they have a paradigm of thought, and they have, of course, a purpose. So they have a very clear opinion, a very clear point of view, and this, of course, will allow them to analyze the issue from a specific angle, aligning with very with particular, of course, causes and beliefs, values, and so on and so forth. Also, focus on how and why. So unlike traditional journalism, for example, that focuses, of course, on who, what, when, where, so, and sometimes it gives just factual accounts. So advocacy journalism delves deeper into and the understanding of how and why. So this is also something very important, how various factors, for example, are interconnected, and why the issue matters, and what it signifies. So all these questions, so they matter. Why, for example, performing those advocacy journalists, for example, performing their job. Also, there is another thing, is that ethical transparency. So advocacy journalists, they are usually upfront with very important issues, and they are upfront about their biases or intentions, rather than claiming total neutrality. So they show and they make their standpoint very visible, to their communities, because they stem from a very pertinent, of course, stance. Emphasis, of course, there is also emphasis on social impact. So the goal of advocacy journalism is often to influence public opinion, to mobilize communities, or affect policy change. So this is also one of the major rules of media advocacy. And this is how we understand it. It goes beyond reporting, or beyond surface superficial, as David Ball claims. So it's beyond superficial reporting. So advocacy journalism criticizes sometimes the limits of commercial journalism, criticizes the limits of traditional classical journalism, but sometimes traditional journalism is like gives you quick superficial summaries, just quick summaries about events all over the world without digging into the context. Unlike it, so media advocacy, it digs into the context of that issue. So it provides us, and it advocates for an in-depth exploration and, of course, sustained attention on critical issues. So these are the major characteristics that we can, for example, talk about while dealing with media advocacy. So it's about, it presents to us, it introduces a clear point of view. It focuses on how and why. It takes into consideration the ethical transparency, and it emphasizes on social impact, on public opinion, and it goes beyond the superficial, for example, reporting, the classical reporting, the quick, fast reporting. Why? Because it digs into very important, critical issues. So the most important thing now is to sometimes to know how or what are the strategies that media advocacy journalists, for example, are using in order to, of course, perform their job well and in order to dig into those critical issues. So we're going to see like a wheel, what we call the wheel planning, and this is a very this is a strategy that is used by many media advocacy journalists. And if you consult, for example, many toolkits, many countries media toolkit, for example, so you will find that this strategy is called the wheel. It's the wheel planning, okay, and it shows deeply the strategies and the steps that media advocacy journalists, for example, follow in order to come up at the end with a very sort of detecting the critical issue, whatever it is, maybe environmental issues, children's rights, climate change, for example, political issues, gender equality, so all the issues that we tackled beforehand. So the first thing that I hope that it's clear. So the first thing that is in this wheel plan, it's the wheel planning of media advocacy, is identifying the issue. So the first thing that those advocacy journalists, for example, do, they identify the issues. What is the issue in the first instance? Is it, for example, is it the question of pollution? Is it the question of water scarcity? Is it the question of immigrant people, for example? Is it an issue? So they identify. So what is the issue? So they identify the issue, and sometimes even because there are many specialized like media advocacy journalists, they work within the organizations. Like what we saw in our previous lectures, so many journalists, they work within the Greenpeace, for example, movement, and they are very specialized in tackling the issues, of course, of the environmental protection or climate change, for example. The same thing when we saw human rights, for example, organization or Amnesty International, when we saw also the global, if you still remember, the global foundation of hope. So you saw how those journalists, how they work, how they publish those intentions and those passionate objectives of that organization. So the first thing, you should identify the issue. Is it education, for example? Is it like crimes in very particular communities? Is it violence, for example? Is it gender-based violence? So it depends. So you identify the issue. The second thing, you analyze the issue. You analyze, it means you ask many questions about the issue. Why does it happen in the first instance? Why, for example, do women until nowadays suffer, for example, why do they suffer from violence in many countries all over the world? Why they are still, for example, in a marginalized, inferior position? So these are questions. So we analyze the issue, we analyze the why, we analyze the what, the how, why does it happen, how, what are the consequences, what are the causes. So this is the analysis. So you see, this media advocacy is really, if we can define it in a very specific and concise and precise way, so we can see that it is a strategic, it is a skillful use, of course, of media in order to tackle very particular issues. So accessing stakeholders. So of course, when you analyze, you identify the issue, you analyze the issue. You should seek opinions from stakeholders, either, for example, stakeholders. It means members of international organizations, local organizations. So, but you should consult. You should you should do research about that issue. So you see, this media advocacy is very based. It's not. It doesn't come from nothing, but it is deeply rooted in research and in very deep study. So you accessing stakeholders. So the fourth thing is to set objectives and targets. Target. This is something also very important in the strategy, in the skillful strategy of media advocacy. So after identifying the issue, analyzing the issue, then accessing stakeholders. So now you set up the objectives. So what are the objectives? What do you target, okay, via that media advocacy? Are you targeting, for example, youth social media, for example, addiction? So this is also a very social phenomenon that of course youth is suffering from. So you should set up your objectives and targets. Then clarifying policy and strategy. As I have said, media advocacy is working from or within a very particular perspective. So the perspective, the approach, the method should be very visible, very clear and tangible. So here you clarify from which perspective are you dealing, for example, with this very particular issue. We're going to see examples and more illustrations till now. So this is just a theoretical, of course, framework of how media advocacy is working. Selecting the tactics, okay, so you should know the tactics. How are you going, for example, to present that issue? Is it, for example, in print media, in social media? So you just select the tactics. What are the strategies, the small tactics that you are going to use in order to introduce that issue or advocate for that issue? Developing the message. So here you develop your, so you see how many, for example, stages. And as I have said, this is by media advocacy journalists, they call it the wheel. It's the wheel planning, okay? So each step leads to another, each step paves the way for another. So this is the wheel planning. So this is how many, if you consult, for example, many media advocacy toolkits in many countries, for example, so you will find that they work, most of them, so they work with these strategies and with this wheel plan. It's later on we will complete the wheel, okay, to just to understand and to assimilate what do you mean. Well, so developing advocacy strategy. So here you develop your advocacy strategy. So are you going to advocate for what? So you develop it, you develop your argument, you develop, because most of the time you persuade, okay? So you should argue for something and you persuade, of course, the viewers, you persuade, of course, your spectators or your community, okay? You implement, and this is something which is very important. So you have all these theoretical things, that's fine, but you should think of how to implement them. And that was a very pertinent question asked by many students during the previous lectures. So you see, anytime when we tackled like human rights declarations, for example, when we tackled many international conventions and many international treaties, so we raised this question: how to implement them, how to render them into practice. And this is the issue. Even this media advocacy, so this will plan, for example, if we would like it to be very fruitful, and of course if we would like it to have like a very effective consequences, effective results, so we should know how to implement, because that's very nice to identify the issue. Yes, there is gender-based violence. This is the issue. That's very good. You identify the context. You analyze the circumstances, social, cultural, political. That's fine. And you access stakeholders. You interview people. You interview, for example, leaders and so on and so forth. Leaders of non-government organizations, as we saw before. So you set your objective. You clarify the policy. So everything is fine. Okay, but when you develop your message, it's fine. So you have tackled the issue. Now you would like to advocate for the issue. You should implement. You implement what? Of course, within the media advocacy, you suggest solutions, and this is something which is very important. So here it's like a collaboration. That media advocacy, of course, it influences public opinion, governmental opinion also. It influences policy decision makers also. So here they should think about how to implement. If you have solutions, if you suggested solutions, for example, to gender-based violence, so how can we implement them? On our reality, for example, how can we, for example, find those solutions concretely? Okay, how can we implement them concretely? So this is a very important stage in the work or in this wheel planning. feedback. So this is something very important. It's all the time when we have a work, when we have a very deep like work, so we have a feedback. We have the like self-evaluation also. So this can be either seeking feedback from your communities, for example, because media advocacy is all the time in touch with communities, in touch with organizations, of course, in touch with the policy decision makers. So sometimes either seeking feedback, receiving feedback, or even this feedback includes self-evaluation. So those media advocacy journalists, they evaluate themselves, they evaluate their working, and this is also sometimes this is something very important. So you see now we have like completed the will. So this is the will planning that is of course advanced by many media advocacy of course programs, and it is very efficient, and of course it works. Now let's see media advocacy. Why does it matter in the first instance? Why we are in dire need of this media advocacy? Why our communities, for example, need this media advocacy? First of all, influencing public policy, because it influences public policy. It plays a critical role in pushing for policy changes sometimes, for pushing for strategy changes sometimes, by shining a light on issues that might otherwise be ignored. So you see sometimes many issues, we don't pay attention to so many issues happening to be in our communities. So this is the role of media advocacy. So it influences public, of course, policy. Raising awareness and shaping public opinion. So this is media advocacy. It brings issues to the forefront, informing and educating the public on matters that impact their lives. So this is it, by framing issues in ways that highlight, for example, that highlight injustices, that highlight, for example, risk. Media advocates also can shift public opinion and build support for change. So this is what we mean by raising awareness and shaping public opinion. Also empowering marginalized voices. So media advocacy gives a platform to voices also, as I have said, underrepresented people in mainstream media, sometimes traditional media, classical media, so they don't pay attention at all to marginalized, vulnerable people, people with disabilities. So here, of course, this is media advocacy. So it empowers marginalized voices in our societies, and by doing this, it challenges, of course, dominant narratives. This is also something very important. Media advocacy really, it's counters based or one-dimensional coverage. So as I have said, so it takes one very particular specific stance. It takes a stance. It argues for something by presenting alternative viewpoints and stories. So it helps to question, for example, stereotypes and deepen public understanding of complex issues. So this is what you mean by challenging dominant narratives, unlike mainstream media or traditional media. Mobilizing communities and driving change. So this is also something very important. So effective media advocacy, as I have said again, not only informs but also inspires communities to take action. This is the major thing, okay, that media advocacy, for example, why it does matter. So it does matter because, of course, it mobilizes communities and it drives, of course, change. It not only informs, but it also inspires communities to take change and to perform sometimes even campaigns on social media, sometimes through traditional media. Yes, also holding institutions accountable. This is also something very important. So it's through investigative, reporting, and kind of consistent coverage. So media advocacy also can hold corporations, governments, and other institutions accountable for their actions. So this is also why does it matter? Okay, because it mobilizes communities because it holds institutions accountable. The third thing is that also bridging urgency to a humanitarian cause. So this media also draws attention to urgent issues like poverty, for example, health crisis, climate change, and many others. So it makes visible many urgent issues that our communities, for example, suffer from. As I have said, media advocacy, it's a skillful strategy to advocate for an issue. So it is an issue-oriented media. And this is why does it matter? Because it bridges urgency to humanitarian cause like poverty, like violence, like crimes, environmental crisis, for example, pandemic issues. So many all the humanitarian causes. So they are part and parcel within the strategy and within strategy of media advocacy. Now let's see some media advocacy tactics. Okay, so what do you mean? So media advocacy is all the time very consistent. Why? Because it maintains a very clear message across platforms. So as I have said from the very beginning, it is very specialized. Okay, and it takes one issue, for example, it develops it until the end. Then another issue, and so on and so forth. So it's a continuous, of course, work. So it maintains a steady message across platforms. Also, this is something very important, credibility also. So credibility, it means that the information they are from credible resources. Why? In order to build trust. Because if there is no trust, so of course communities cannot believe in what media advocacy is doing. So building trust is something also very important via seeking credible sources. Engagement, so it encourages audience participation through shares, comments, or calls to action. And this is something very important. So it's not separate from our communities, from from viewers, spectators, from listeners, or from followers. No, it has this tactic of engagement. So as we will go back now to that picture, you see the man, if you still remember, the man tapping on his laptop, and the woman taking her tablet. So you see behind the man, the thumbs up, for example, share some hearts, for example, the icon. Also, we have forgotten to maybe you have also deciphered something on that very important picture, is the light bulb icon. Have you seen the light bulb icon? So that light bulb icon, it means what? It means not just engagement, credibility, consistency, but there is something very important, creativity and innovation. And this is something also that is part and parcel in media advocacy strategies. Okay, it's creativity. So it provides, it sheds light on issues, but of course it propounds like innovative solutions sometimes. Okay, so creativity, this is something also very important. So if you still remember that picture, so you have all these elements that we have spoken about, so you have them in that picture. Well, so now we are going just to talk, because we have already tackled all, maybe almost all the organizations, and we talked about development journalism and how, because this is something, it is very overlapped. So I will just show you some illustrations that, for example, media advocacy tackles like environmental protections. We have talked about, I think that now we are familiar with these things. We have talked about the Greenpeace use of media advocacy in raising awareness about climate change, for example. If you still remember, we talked about the anti-whaling movement. Yes, okay. So we have tackled all these issues, and we have also tackled how media advocacy, for example, is intertwined with those organizations' agenda. When even we talked about the foundation of the Global Foundation of Hope. So we have almost tackled the same issue. Also, this is something that we began with. It's public health awareness. So we have already talked about so many. For example, organizations, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. So this media advocacy, of course, played a very pivotal role in depicting, portraying, of course, the issue, especially in collaboration with health organizations all over the world. Human rights campaign. So I think this is the first, maybe that is related to the first lecture. So we have talked about so many organizations and how media, for example, interacts with those organizations, how those groups advocate for issues like gender equality, like anti-violence legislation, for example, and how they provide statistics, sometimes stories, expert opinions, in order to inspire empathy, sometimes in order to drive reforms, legal reforms, even sometimes. So we have seen so many examples, and these are just some issues that are tackled mostly by media advocacy journalists. Media advocacy measures. So we're going to see how to measure. Of course, we have talked in the wheel plan. So we have talked about the last thing is feedback. It's the self-evaluation, because media advocacy, after dealing with the issues, so this self-evaluation, this is something very important in life in general. Why? Because when you handle the self-criticism or evaluation. So of course, this is the first thing that that leads people, leads organization to what? To challenge, of course, the obstacles, to learn from their mistakes, for example, and to improve their missions, to improve, refine develop their strategies. Why? Because they measure what this is working and that strategy is not working, so we should update it, we should change it, and so forth. Because the world is really developing fast, so we should be in a balance with that development. And this is something even within media advocacy measure. So measuring is something very important. Sometimes there is we measure like media coverage. It means, or sometimes audience engagement. It means social media metrics. We What do we measure? We measure social media metrics. Like what? Like the shares. You see, we will go back to that picture. Okay. So we can measure the likes, for example, the shares, the comments that show audience interaction. So this is how we can, because engagement is something very important in media advocacy strategy. So we measure of course the social media metrics, for example, and the audience engagement. We measure also another thing is. Media coverage. It means counting mentions in newspapers, websites, in broadcasts, of course, can indicate the campaign reach. Okay, so we measure also. So we measure the media coverage in order to know to what extent that media advocacy for that very particular issue, to what extent it was or it is very successful in dealing with that particular issue. So we measure it like this. Also, sometimes even we can measure policy change, because this is the aim of media advocacy. So it intends, it tackles, it identifies the issue. Why? Because at the end, in order to what, to implement, in order to drive change, for example, and this is something very important. Sometimes even surveys can show shifts in public opinion following campaigns, indicating whether the advocacy resonates with the audience or not. So this is how we measure, of course, media advocacy. This is something very important, as I have said, in self evaluation. So as you see here, Until now, so we have talked about media advocacy, like the will plan, media advocacy key components, media advocacy tactics, and media advocacy measure. We have also defined what we mean by advocacy and what is media advocacy in the first instance. This is something very important. And what is preponderant also is that this media advocacy really it uses very skillful, very strategic policies in order methods also in order to influence the public and in order to drive change in order to do something in our communities, in our society. It works hand in hand with global organizations, local organizations, and we are going to see later on some examples, but after we are going to go forward, okay, to seek future, for example, aspirations, okay, how can we, or what we, for example, as members of our communities, how can we deal with this media advocacy, following all the time some iconic figures, as some students, for example, claimed in previous sessions. So all the time when we finish the lecture, there will be an iconic figure whom we can follow, for example, to refine our methods and our strategies, especially dealing with human rights and media tracking. So there is no harm. There is no harm to have some iconic figures whom we can, for example, take as ideal figures who have defined the human rights and who have been militant and who have their say, of course, in our societies. Even nowadays, they are all the time with us. So. Well, so we're going to watch a video. So it entails maybe very pertinent examples about how media advocacy is working. Then afterward, we're going to see how we can aspire to have a very better future dealing with this media advocacy.
In the year 2000, the leaders of the world promised to get all children into school by 2015. But today, 58 million children are still missing out on the opportunity to attend even one day at primary school.
That's terrible.
I know.
It's not fair.
It's more than the population of South Africa out of school.
The people in charge should be doing a better job.
Exactly.
Without universal education, nations will have more poverty, worse health, and more war.
My little brother, he's meant to be starting his education next year, but his school's just closed down.
Oh, right.
The building was badly damaged in an attack and nobody can say when it is going to reopen. Meanwhile, my brother and hundreds of other children have nowhere to learn.
What are you going to do?
I can't just sit and watch it happen.
No.
No way. You know what? I'm going to protest.
Yeah.
And campaign until they open the school again.
Brilliant.
Not just for my brother, but for all the 28 million children who are out of school because of conflict around the world.
Leonie?
Yes?
I want to help.
You? Well, we'll need to be organized, Johnny.
I can do that.
We'll need to get people inspired.
Not a problem.
We'll need to learn how to make change happen through the power of advocacy.
The power of advocacy?
All around the world, young people have got together to demand that world leaders deliver on their promise of universal education. And we're being heard.
Cool.
But more help is needed.
Count me in.
An organization called Plan worked with loads of young people and some amazing organizations like UNICEF, UNESCO and A World at School to develop an advocacy toolkit. This toolkit provides everything you need, whatever your campaign, to join the millions of young leaders around the world.
To advocate for change.
As Malala Yousafzai said, it's time to speak up.
I'm going to be like Mahatma Gandhi challenging injustice, or Nelson Mandela inspiring change.
If you say so, Johnny.
Right, so what do we do first?
We can follow the steps in the toolkit. We need to make a plan and then talk to the people in power.
We should research the issues so we can properly argue our points.
And find some more people who also want to campaign.
We could arrange a meeting with someone in government.
We better prepare.
I'm ready for anything.
And be clear about what we want.
They'll have to listen to us.
And prove to them how important this school is.
Exactly.
The advocacy toolkit will help us get started.
A friend of mine in the Philippines, called Rolando, he campaigned for schools in his country to integrate people with special needs into mainstream education. He went around the country and held student-teacher workshops to explain the importance of such a policy.
That's amazing.
After 3 months of campaigning, schools started to change.
So if Rolando can make a difference, so can we.
Right.
There's a tool in the Advocacy Toolkit that can help us prepare for a lobbying meeting.
But lobbying isn't the only thing we can do, right?
No, we should create a campaign to get ourselves noticed.
So that people know what's going on.
And those in power can't ignore us.
We could organise a rally.
We can join other young people to launch a global Rise Up for School petition. We can get millions to support it by asking our friends to sign on and share it online.
We could hold a public meeting.
Or a sit-in.
Or a strike.
In the toolkit, there's a story about an orphan in Burundi called Salatiel. He lost his parents in the civil war and couldn't afford his school fees, so he got suspended from class. He was so angry, but he formed an association of orphans and spread the word around the country about what was happening. He got on the radio and everything, and he forced the government to change.
Do you think we could get on the radio?
Why not?
And the television?
Sure.
We could be stars.
And we could keep the school open, Johnny. That's the most important thing.
Yeah, of course. Do you think we can get some journalists to our events?
If we get enough people behind us, they'll come.
I'm excited.
Me too.
It's going to be brilliant.
There'll be ups and downs, Johnny.
I know.
We'll have to stay motivated.
Your brother has to go to school.
But we really can make the difference.
Not just for your brother, but for all the children and young people being denied the right to education right now.
Imagine a world where every child receives a good quality education.
Where young people can make a better world.
Where everyone has an opportunity.
And everyone has a future.
We need concrete steps to address this global education crisis.
That will put every child in school.
So that their ambitions can flourish and their potential be fulfilled.
I know we can make a difference.
We, the young people of the world, call on all governments to deliver education for all. Right now. Visit the Plan website for more information on creating your own advocacy campaigns and to download the Youth Advocacy Toolkit in full.
So as you see, this is a very significant, very symbolic video that illustrates, of course, how this media advocacy is indeed working. So this is a very symbolic video, and it signifies, it illustrates how media advocacy members all over the world, how they work, how they engage, and how they build like a global connection among them. And this is something very important. This is how we are going to conclude our lecture by, again, I will refer you again to David Ball's book on Mahatma Gandhi journalism. So this insight is taken from Mahatma Gandhi, because when Mahatma Gandhi engaged or established like a newspaper, the Indian Opinion, okay, it was a newspaper that began in South Africa. He told the members and the advocate people that newspaper should be the amplifier voice for Indian people and for South African people. So it should cross the borders of the country, and this is something very important. So this is what Mahatma Gandhi, and I was very inspired by his advocacy, because he advocated for something great that takes India to establish what we call transnationalism. Transnationalism, this is also something very important that media advocacy is even using nowadays, because of digital, of course, media, because of those technological facilities. So this media advocacy cannot just tackle community issues, local community issues, but it can transcend the borders of the community and build like a global world based on transnationalism. This is a very inspiring indeed argument that was, of course, advanced by Mahatma Gandhi. And if you would like to dig into this book, so of course into this issue, please consult the book of David. So you have the references here, so you consult the book of David Ball, Gandhi Journalism, a Communication History. Okay, this is a very pertinent book that you can consult later on. So thank you very much. Thank you for your attendance.